Good evening. It is a pleasure to gather with you for this special occasion, and I'm just delighted to see this auditorium so full. I am Heather Miller Rubens, the Executive Director and Roman Catholic Scholar at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies, and it really is truly a joy to see this room so full tonight. Before we begin, I want to offer deep thanks to our hosts here at Goucher College, whose commitment to public conversations and engaged civic life make this the perfect venue for tonight's ICJS Manekin-Clark Forum with David Rubenstein. It is now my pleasure to welcome the president of Goucher College, Kent Devereaux, who will offer a few opening remarks. Please join me in welcoming President Devereaux.
So welcome here to Goucher College, and we are so honored to be host for this event tonight, a place where kind of honest conversation, dialogue can happen, and a variety of events through here. And I just wanted to take one moment just to invite you back and give you an idea of some of the things that we have happening at Goucher College. If this is your first time or if you're 100th time coming to our campus, I just wanted to kind of highlight a few things. So, and starting off this Thursday, if you still have some energy after opening day at Camden Yard, you might think about coming on up here because we're going to be hosting on the campus the first Baltimore County Executive Forum with all of the candidates present here, and we'll be doing this twice this spring, so you get an opportunity to meet the Baltimore County Executive Forum candidates and decide which way the county will go in the future. But we also have a variety of musical events coming up. This Friday, Black Eyed Susies, an all-women bluegrass band. 2 weeks from now, on April 10th, a comedian, Irene Tu from Netflix, will be here in the other space. And so tickets still available for that. And I will mention a number of other events, and unfortunately, they're sold out. But to give you an idea of some of the things. Percival Everett, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author, is going to be here this Sunday, March 29th. It is sold out. I mention that now because next year we're going to be hosting 4 more New York Times best-selling authors. So stay in the loop and be sure to get tickets for that. We have Bella Fleck, Beat Trio, here on April 16th. Still tickets available for that. Pete Buttigieg here May 7th. That is also sold out. But coming this fall, we have another event in that same series. Brian Stevenson from the Equal Justice Initiative is going to be here November 19th. Tickets for that go on sale June 8th. So that's coming. And also next year, we're going to be hosting the Kronos String Quartet, the world-famous string quartet on their world tour. They'll be here. So those events will be publicized later this spring, available this fall. So by all means, check in every once in a while, just events.goucher.edu, add your name to our mailing list so you can take part in some of these events. Many of our events are free, and some of them are ticketed, but get in the loop. We love to have community members on our campus. That is the whole purpose of a college, to really be a place of convening and different ideas can come together. So welcome to Goucher College, and let me hand it back to Heather from ICJS for a little bit about this evening's program. Thank you.
Thank you, Kent. And now let me say a word about why we're all here tonight. Many of you may be encountering ICJS for the first time, so let me briefly introduce who we are as an organization. ICJS is an independent educational nonprofit based here in Baltimore, located actually right across the street from Goucher College. For nearly 40 years, we've been working to build an interreligious society where people of all religions, including no religion, have an equal role in shaping our civic and political life. At ICJS, we believe something quite simple but quite radical, that America's religious differences could actually be a powerful force for good. At ICJS, we believe that a multi-religious democracy is not only desirable, but it is possible, and that we need to work to build it together. In this current moment, the American experiment in having a multi-religious democracy may seem beyond our reach. While religious diversity is a fact of American life since the founding, Most people don't know how to engage their neighbors, their coworkers, their families about religious and ethical differences. In fact, most Americans fear that our religious diversity is always dangerous. And this is not an irrational position. When you open your phone or you turn on the news, the picture can seem very bleak. We see increasing religious bigotry directed at our Jewish and Muslim neighbors. We see a rise in Christian nationalism that wants to suppress and control differences of all kinds. At ICJS, this reality makes us want to get to work dismantling religious bias and bigotry and building communities where our religious differences are a powerful force for good. If this idea resonates with you tonight, I hope you'll explore more of our work at icjs.org and perhaps join us again at one of the many learning and dialogue opportunities that we host throughout the year. But now back to tonight. This evening is one of ICJS's most cherished traditions. The Manekin-Clark Forum honors the extraordinary interreligious friendship between two business leaders, Bernie Manekin, who was Jewish, and Jim Clark, who was Presbyterian. Their interreligious friendship was not only deep and enduring, but it helped inspire the founding vision of ICJS 40 years ago. Bernie and Jim's story reminds us that when people take the risk of truly knowing one another across religious difference, something remarkable can happen. Institutions like ICJS can be created to build a resilient civic life. Communities can slowly change and become more inclusive. This is the hope and the promise of ICJS. This is our vision of the future. Tonight, we are here to talk about religion, politics, and history. Because, as Mark Twain famously quipped, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. That is why we need to explore the role that religion has played in our nation's past and consider again, in this 250th anniversary of our country's founding, what we can learn from those thinkers and leaders who came before us. My conversation partner tonight, David Rubenstein, is perfectly positioned for such a conversation. And in the spirit of enduring friendship, I would like to invite someone special to the stage to introduce our guest. Bob Manekin, one of Bernie Manekin's sons, has been a lifelong friend of ICJS and of this event. And he is a childhood friend of David Rubenstein, which makes him well-positioned to welcome our special guest. Please join me in welcoming Bob Manekin to the stage.
Good evening, and welcome to the 2026 Manekin-Clark Forum on American Experiments, Democracy and Religion, featuring a conversation with David Rubenstein. As you know, my name is Bob Manekin, and I am honored to introduce our distinguished guest, whom I have known since high school. But before introducing David, I wanted to give you a little context. This annual forum, as Heather indicated, grew out of the relationship between Jim Clark and my father. Jim and Dad were not only business partners, but close personal friends. They also came from very different backgrounds. Jim was born in Richmond, grew up in Silver Spring. He was a Presbyterian, successful business executive in the construction industry, and a Ronald Reagan Republican. Dad was born in Philadelphia, grew up in Baltimore, was Jewish, and also had a successful career in real estate. He was a lifelong FDR Democrat. Yet these two men formed an incredibly strong bond and a mutual admiration that enabled them to discuss the issues of the day in a meaningful and constructive way. They even developed a personal code of communication. If someone were successful, honest, ethical, and community-oriented, he was, quote, our kind of guy. My brother and I have numerous memories of Dad saying, Jim said so-and-so was, or in certain cases was not, our kind of guy. That was part of their code. Well, for the record, David Rubenstein is their kind of a guy. Now, reviewing David's resume is honestly exhausting. Seriously. How one person can have accomplished so much during his lifetime, which is still very robust, is, in a word, amazing. In government, private enterprise, philanthropy, academia, media, and now professional sports, David's activities and accomplishments are well known. However, what is not as well known is that he is basically the same guy he was in high school. Modest, self-effacing, hardworking, wicked smart, engaged in community, and genuine in dealing with people. Granted, his balance sheet now is a little better than it was in high school, but I'd like to think all of ours are. David is a pioneer. He pioneered the concept of private equity, patriotic philanthropy, and the giving pledge. With regards to patriotic philanthropy, just a few of his transformative gifts were renovating public landmarks as the Washington Monument, Memorial, the Memorial, Mount Vernon, to name a few. As the original signer of the Giving Pledge, he has pledged to give the majority of his wealth to charitable causes. But it is his academic pursuits, his authoring of 5 books, only one of which, by the way, was related to investing, and his interviews with hundreds of leaders in all fields of endeavor, that is what makes him uniquely qualified to be here this evening to discuss democracy and religion. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Baltimore native, distinguished City College graduate, and proud Orioles owner, David Rubenstein.
Whatever Bob said, it's not nearly as good, so lower your expectations. I'm not as good as he said, and I'm not likely to be as knowledgeable as I should be on this subject, but go ahead.
Well, thank you, David, for joining us tonight. I've been looking forward to this conversation, and not just because it's opening day at Camden Yards in 2 days, but I will ask you an Orioles question on behalf of my 12-year-old at the end of this evening. So, I want to have a conversation about religion, politics, and history with you. Topics I get to talk about personally and professionally all the time, but arguably makes me not very popular at parties. But tonight isn't a party, it's a conversation with you. And I'm hopeful that we can have a thoughtful conversation about religion and American history. You are a lifelong enthusiastic student of American history, and I'm eager to sort of learn your thoughts about our American experiments with religion and democracy. I want to start at your beginnings. Could you tell us a little bit more about your Baltimore roots and your family's background?
Sure. My family, on my father's side and my mother's side, came to the United States, I think, in the early part of the 20th century from Eastern Europe or Ukraine area, actually. And they came to Baltimore for reasons I don't really know. It wasn't because of the Orioles, because the Orioles weren't around then. But I think it was a number of reasons they came here. And then my father was one of 7 children, and he was the last one. And when World War II broke out, he dropped out of high school to go into World War II, the Marines, and went and fought in the South Pacific. Came back, and he met my mother. She was very young. He was 20 years old when he came back. She was 17. They got married, and I was born more than 9 months later. And I was their only child. And my father, although the GI Bill enabled hundreds of thousands of Americans who had fought in the war to go to college, my father never took advantage of that because he hadn't finished high school, for one thing, and he just wanted to get married and have a family and so forth. So he basically got a job that was available to you when you were not a college or high school graduate. He worked in the civil service and worked in the post office for his entire career. And I lived in Northwest Baltimore and went to public high schools, Falstaff Elementary, and then Pimlico Junior High School, and then Baltimore City College, and that was my family's background. And then I have a number of cousins, one of whom is here somewhere, I don't know where she is, but I have some cousins and still live in Baltimore. But I mostly, after I graduated from high school at City College in '66, I went off to Duke, and largely I've lived outside of the city, either New York or Washington principally, or really Bethesda, Maryland, for most of the last 50 years or so.
What was the Jewish community like in Baltimore when you were growing up?
Well, the Jewish life in Baltimore was somewhat different than it is today. Today, my impression is that it has a more heavily oriented Orthodox position than maybe it did then. But ironically, I was bar mitzvahed and went to a Hebrew school at what's called an Orthodox, it was an Orthodox synagogue. In those days, if you were reasonably wealthy, maybe it's changed, but if you were reasonably wealthy, you were in a Reform synagogue. If you were modestly wealthy and so forth, middle class, you tended to go in a conservative. And then if you were poor and you didn't have much money, relatively speaking, you tended to be, in my observation, go to Orthodox. And so I was in an Orthodox synagogue. I didn't really understand what was going on a lot, but I went to Hebrew school so that I could be bar mitzvahed. And then after 6 years of Hebrew school, the Rabbi Green from Rogers Avenue Synagogue, went to my mother and said, he's a very nice young boy, but I'm going to write it out for him phonetically in English so he can make sure he gets through this bar mitzvah. So I said, if I'd known you could write it out phonetically and read in English, I wouldn't have gone to Hebrew school all those years. I could have become a good athlete practicing or something. But so I was bar mitzvahed, and at the time, Baltimore was a city that had, as I think everybody here knows Baltimore City, Baltimore was among the more rigidly segregated cities in the United States by religion and ethnicity. In the Supreme Court in 1948, on a case called Shelley v. Kramer, restrictive mortgages were outlawed, which is to say you can't have a mortgage that says you can't sell to a black or a Jew. Baltimore never quite got the word, and so Baltimore basically, more or less informally, enforced these restrictive covenants that weren't legal anymore. And so people who were Jewish tended to live in Northwest Baltimore. There were some rare exceptions of that, and there were, people who were wealthy lived in one part, people in middle class lived in another, and the poorer ones lived in another part of it. And that was, Baltimore had a lot of synagogues and a reasonably good-sized Jewish population for its overall population. But Baltimore, and their books have been written about this, and some of you may know this. At the time, wealthy Jewish developers were able to build apartment buildings and houses in non-Jewish areas on the proviso that they not sell those houses to people who are Jewish or apartments. So it was enforced sort of, even though we weren't allowed to have restrictive covenants anymore. We more or less had restrictive covenants in Baltimore well through the 60s.
Could you speak a little bit more about that, about your experience of both racial diversity and maybe religious diversity at that time?
Well, Baltimore was fairly segregated at the time. The black population of Baltimore lived in areas that are not dissimilar from somewhere the black population is now. The ethnic areas in Baltimore, the Italian, Greek, other ethnic groups were in certain parts of South Baltimore, and they didn't have a lot of the black populations. And remember, the Civil Rights Act of '64 occurred when I was in junior high school, and so up before '64, segregation was not legal in Baltimore, but effectively you had segregation. And I remember in a youth group that I was in, the Lancers Boys Club that was started by Judge Robert Hammerman, we had a vote, I think in 1961 or 62, whether we should integrate. And, thinking back on it, how could you have a vote like that? Why would you even have a vote like that? But today, that seems incongruous, but in those days it was considered not unusual to have segregated organizations, effectively segregated.
I want to jump ahead to 2007, and when you purchased the only privately owned copy of the Magna Carta, when it went up for auction, and that is now in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., where everyone can see it. This acquisition of the Magna Carta launched you on your journey to preserve historic documents and buildings and to really focus on American history. And I'm just wondering if you could talk about your journey into exploring our nation's history.
Well, as a young man, when I was a boy, I was enamored with politics and government. My sixth grade teacher in Falstaff Elementary, Mrs. Shaw, the day after John Kennedy was inaugurated, went through his inaugural address, word for word, line for line, and it was an incredible speech. Any of you who have gone through it, it was a 22-minute speech. I think probably the best inaugural address of the 20th century. It was a real call to arms, and it was brilliantly written by a man named Ted Sorensen. And I didn't think I had the charm, the good looks, the money, the personality to be a candidate like John Kennedy, but I thought I could maybe be a speechwriter or an advisor to somebody who was president. So my role model after watching his speech and then reading more about President Kennedy was to be like the man who wrote that speech. And after I graduated from law school, I did work for Ted Sorensen at a law firm in New York, and then later he helped me get a job in Washington. Ultimately, I went to work in the White House at a more junior position than the one he had had. And then when you work in the White House, you do get a sense of history because you're living in Washington. You're in the same building that famous presidents of the United States have worked in. And so I did get a sense of history. And with respect to the Magna Carta, what actually happened was there are 17 extant copies of the Magna Carta, which you've probably all heard about. And the original one was from 1215, but that never went into existence. The famous thing you've heard about in Runnymede, King John, so forth, King John put his seal on the Magna Carta in 1215 because he was illiterate, he couldn't write, so he put a seal on it. But he basically said in that Magna Carta, yes, the barons would have certain rights because they were fighting for him, against him, because he wanted to tax them to get more money to fight to recover lands in France that the King of England thought he should have. Well, ultimately, the King of England in those days was under the Pope. And the Pope said, wait a second, you've agreed in this Magna Carta that if 25 barons overrule you on something, that you have to do what they want. I don't like the idea that somebody like a king can be overruled, because if a king can be overruled, maybe a pope can be overruled. So I'm going to excommunicate you unless you get rid of this Magna Carta. So King John said, okay, I'm going to abrogate it. He did. Then the barons went to war. He died in the war. And King John was considered the worst king ever because no king in England has ever named himself John after King John. And then subsequent Magna Cartas were issued to kind of stop the barons from fighting and so forth. Of the 17 extant copies, 15 are in British institutions. Presumably they won't move from them. One was sold in the Australian Parliament in 1960s, 2 or so. And then one was owned by a British family for 800 years. And they went land poor in the early, I think, 80s, and they sold it to Ross Perot. And Ross Perot bought it. He sent his lawyer over to pick it up. He rolled it up in a kind of a folder, in a cylinder, and took it through British Customs. And they said, well, what are you taking in that cylinder? And they said, it's the Magna Carta. They thought it was a joke. He got it through. And then he put it on display at the National Archives. And then later, for a lot of complicated reasons, he decided to sell it. And it was the only one in private hands. So somebody invited me to a viewing of the Magna Carta, which I hadn't been that focused on, honestly. And I went to this viewing. It was in New York, and it turned out it was really the night before an auction of the Magna Carta was going to occur because Ross Perot was going to sell it. And the very clever curator said, well, it's going to be sold to somebody from a country that really shouldn't have the Magna Carta. Somebody from Russia might be buying this, or somebody from some other countries he mentioned. I said, okay, I got it. And so I said, I'm going to try to go back and keep it for the country. And I didn't want to tell anybody because it sounded presumptuous to say I'm going to go buy the Magna Carta tomorrow. And I didn't want to tell my children. They'd say, how much less money might this mean for us if you buy this? So I ultimately went back the next night. I went there. I got into the bidding room, and they put me in a little room with a telephone. You pick it up, and they started bidding. And they said, well, you're bidding? You're just sitting there. You're not doing anything. I said, well, okay, I'll put in one bid. I put a bid, and they said, sold right away. So I didn't think anybody else had to bid. But I won. And then I said I would give it to the National Archives as a gift to the country, to kind of begin to repay my obligation to the country. And so it is in the National Archives. And the reason it's important is because it was the document that was, to some extent, the inspiration for our Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, and our Bill of Rights. Interestingly, in the 1215 version, it said, if you owe money to people who are Jewish, you don't have to pay, essentially. And, I didn't think that was very nice, but a lot of the Jews were forced to be money lenders then, and so some of the barons, they stuck in all their provisions, and one of them was they didn't want to pay back the money they'd borrowed from Jewish money lenders, so they put that provision in. But the version I bought was actually the later version of 1297. It doesn't have that provision in there. And I said, wow, maybe they like Jews better. It turned out they kicked all the Jews out of England in 1270, so there were no Jews left. But then I began the process of buying other historic documents and fixing historic buildings, and I've been doing that for a while now. And the reason to do this, let me just explain. I have bought a lot of historic documents, and I own more copies of the rare copies of the Declaration of Independence than anybody in the country, and I lend them to the U.S. government. The U.S. government doesn't have the copies that I have, unfortunately. And so I lend them copies of the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery, the Constitution, Bill of Rights. What's the point of this? Why preserve these documents so people can see them? And let me just explain the reason to do this. We don't learn history very much anymore, and we don't teach history so much. It used to be when I was in college, 9% of undergraduates were history majors. Now it's about 1% because people are afraid if they're not a STEM major, they won't get a job at Google or Goldman Sachs. So we don't teach history very much anymore, and the result is our children and young people don't know much about our history. And it's a sad situation because the theory of studying history is if you don't remember the past, you're condemned to relive it. And so I'm trying to, in this year particularly, remind people of the American history, get people to learn more about it, and hopefully they will see historic documents. The human brain works a certain way. Right now, maybe in 100 years from today, or maybe 200 years from today, if you see a copy of the Magna Carta, the Declaration of Independence, on a computer slide, it'll have the same impact on your learning ability as if you see the original. But today, if you see an original, a preserved copy, it's much more likely you're going to remember that you saw it, you're going to learn more about it, and more likely you're going to be able to talk more about it than you would if you just saw it on a computer slide. That might change in the future. But the reason to preserve documents and buildings is it has a much greater impact on the human brain today, and hopefully it's a modest contribution to reminding people of our history. That's the reason to do these things.
Thank you. I want to build on that, your work of preserving and presenting America's founding political texts. In a lot of ways, I think it's akin to what religious communities can do with preserving and presenting sacred texts, and in many ways, these are our sort of sacred civic texts. I trained as a historian at the University of Chicago, and yeah, was a history major, so and did okay. And I'm very familiar with that sort of dual calling of preserving and protecting significant texts, but then the second part that you mentioned about education and interpretation and that sort of next generation. And as we're in this moment of the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, I'm wondering if you could, and the issue of religion is really hotly contested right now. I'm wondering if you could talk about maybe some of the ways that you go about interpreting and educating around these founding documents.
Well, I try to talk about it as much as I can in various places, and I have been going around the country talking about why we're celebrating the 250th anniversary of the country this year and why it's important to know something about the country's history. And I've been providing copies of the Declaration of Independence to historic copies of the document to many different groups, and I'll do some of that tomorrow morning in New York to a large audience. I think that in the case of religious documents and religious things, I have one of the largest collections of Bibles in the United States. The first Hebrew Bible printed here, the first first Bible printed in the United States, first German copy, Hebrew copy, and so forth. And I put them on display just to remind people about religious documents as well. But on the Declaration, what I said to some people earlier, and I hate to repeat it, but essentially, for those who have already heard it, the reason we celebrate the 250th anniversary is the same reason we celebrate birthdays and other things. It's important to remark important events. Why are we celebrating 1776? You think about this. We broke away from England in 1776. We weren't a country then. Nobody recognized us. We hadn't won the war. And why do we celebrate that day? Why don't we celebrate the day we actually won the war, which is, really, you could say, 1781 when the Battle of Yorktown, or 1783 when the Treaty of Paris agreed to, or why not celebrate 1789 when the Constitution went into effect, or later when the Bill of Rights went into effect, or when slavery was eliminated, which was a birth defect of our country. We ended slavery in 1865. Why don't we celebrate that as the real beginning of our country? Or when women finally got the right to vote in 1920. We don't celebrate that. We celebrate 1776 for lots of historic reasons. But in 1776, when the vote on July the 2nd was taken to break away from England, a unanimous vote, John Adams then wrote to his wife and said, "This will be the day, July the 2nd, we'll celebrate for the rest of American history, because that's the day we broke away." But we don't celebrate July the 2nd, we celebrate July the 4th. Why is that? Because July the 2nd, 1777, they were so busy in the Second Continental Congress, they forgot the date. And they didn't get organized. They realized at the end of the day, this is July 2nd, we're not celebrating. So they finally got organized to do it on the 4th. But the reason we do it on the 4th is that the Declaration of Independence has a sentence in there that became the creed of our country. And as we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's the creed of the country. Even though Thomas Jefferson wrote it and he was a slave owner, and even though we obviously didn't treat everybody with equality and still don't yet, the idea that we can live up to maybe this principle of everybody being equal with the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that's what we're really celebrating. And that principle is the one that has been used around the world where democracies have broken out in countries where they didn't have democracies. People cite our Declaration of Independence in that sentence as the reason for why they think they should have the kind of independence and freedom that they want. And so that's why we're really celebrating. And I think people should try to, and during this year, take your children to some historic sites, take your children to places where they can see some historic documents, and maybe they'll absorb some of this, and maybe they'll realize the importance of it. So how many of you remember the 200th anniversary when we celebrated 1976? It was a pretty nice celebration. John Warner was the head of it, later became a senator. And you know, today we politicized the celebration a bit, and there are two different groups celebrating the 250th, and very few people can actually say semi-quincentennial, which is what we're celebrating. But I think people should try to educate their children more about this and educate themselves more about our American history.
I want to shift to Thomas Jefferson, and I feel like we've got a good segue here. So he famously wrote his own epitaph for his tombstone, which said, author of the Declaration of Independence, mother of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. And I'd like to focus with you tonight on his vision, his claim to motherhood, and to really explore the concept of religious freedom that he had. And specifically, I want to focus in on the fact that he owned a Quran. And wow. That he purchased that sort of 10 years before he wrote the Declaration of Independence, while he was still a law student at the time, and really had a capacious understanding of religious freedom.
Thomas Jefferson was 33 years old when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. He would say he didn't take any original ideas and put them on the paper. He was taking the ideas that people already had, but they were ideas he took from John Locke and from David Hume and Montesquieu and from George Mason. He kind of plagiarized a lot of other people, but plagiarism was considered acceptable in those days. You were honoring people by writing some of the things they already said. Thomas Jefferson was criticized as a person in those days for not being a sufficient Christian. When 1814 occurred and the British invaded our capital and burned the White House and the Capitol, and in the Capitol was the Library of Congress. The Library of Congress was in the Capitol building in those days, didn't have a separate building. All of our books of our Library of Congress were burned. Thomas Jefferson had the biggest private library in the United States, and he offered to sell all the 14,000 volumes to the Library of Congress and to the country, and ultimately decided to do it. But Congress said he isn't a person who really believes in Christianity the way he should. He is a deist. The deist, D-E-I-S-T, is somebody who believes in God, but not somebody that's overseeing every little thing that people are doing on the earth. They kind of set the world in motion, but not the day-to-day paying attention to all of what humans are doing. And as a result of that, the Congress required people to go through every single book he had to make sure that they were not anti-Christian books. And interestingly, later, it turns out that Thomas Jefferson developed his own Bible. He took the Bible that we now know as the Bible, and he took out all the miracles that Jesus Christ was attributed to have done, and he took them out thinking that that wasn't realistic, I guess, and he got his own Bible. So Thomas Jefferson was not nearly as religious as some of the other leaders in those days, and he did believe in religious freedom, and that's a unique concept. At the time of the Declaration of Independence, in 1776, there were roughly 2,000 Jewish people in the United States, and there were probably 2,000 Catholics. There were maybe 30 or 40,000 Muslims. Why? Because many of the African slaves had come over from parts of Africa and that were Muslim. And so there were, ironically, enormous number of Muslims compared to Jews and Catholics at the time. Obviously, the Muslims who were slaves didn't have much religious freedom. But Thomas Jefferson believed in religious freedom, and maybe more so than many of the other founding fathers. And ultimately, the reason he said on his epitaph, I really am proud of having done something on religious freedom, is because that was one of his most important beliefs. And then, as we all know, in what was going to be the Third Amendment, but now it's the First Amendment, the Constitution, we have religious freedom, which was very important to James Madison as well, who really drafted the Bill of Rights. And so I think Thomas Jefferson did believe in religious freedom. He didn't believe in many of the miracles that were attributed to Christ. Was he willing to say that he was going to have somebody be Jewish be his best friend? That was very novel in those days. There were only 2,000 Jews in the country at the time. Almost all of them were Sephardic Jews, and there were about 100 to 200 Jews that fought in the Revolutionary War. And Jews, though, were not considered they didn't have the right to vote in most places. Most states did not give people who were Jewish the right to vote in those days.
Yeah, I want to linger here a little bit more with you. In Jefferson's time, the concept of religious freedom, like you just said, was really novel and right. was being contested among European thinkers especially. And even John Locke, right, in his letter concerning toleration, doesn't tolerate Catholics, Muslims, or atheists, right? They're sort of beyond the pale. And so for Thomas Jefferson to have purchased a Quran, studied it, and had this kind of capacious understanding of religious freedom, I think might be
the irony is this country was set up to some extent by pilgrims and Puritans who were trying to escape the religious constraints that they found in England, yet they came over here and imposed religious constraints themselves. And the truth was that people were trying to escape the intolerance that England had and Europe had for religious beliefs that were not the same as the majority of the population, yet they came over here and did the same thing to people that were minorities in their civilization or their population. So we finally got around to religious freedom in the Bill of Rights, and it was largely observed in each of the states then had their own constitutions, and largely they had a kind of Bill of Rights in their state constitutions. But religious freedom on the paper is one thing. Actually letting people practice it and not discriminating against them is a completely different thing. So it's one thing to say it in printing, but it's another thing to actually practice it. And we obviously had a lot of discrimination and still do for religious reasons in this country.
Lingering on that, I would say at ICJS we're very much aware with our Jewish and Muslim friends that there's a certain amount of fear right now with regards to anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and a growing sense that maybe religious freedom is for me but not for thee, as it were. And I'm wondering if there's a way in which Thomas Jefferson, the stories around his understanding of religious freedom could be relevant for our contemporary moment.
Well, Thomas Jefferson lived in an era before there was the kind of anti-Semitism that we have today. Anti-Semitism, remember, anti-Semitism has existed before Christianity existed. If you believe in the stories of the Bible, the Jews were imprisoned in Egypt, and presumably because they were religion, and they escaped from Egypt ultimately, but Christianity hadn't been invented yet. So there was already discrimination against Jews even before Christianity came along. Obviously, when Christianity came along, because of some things that were said in the Bible and the New Testament, the anti-Semitism began to arise, and it became virulent for over 2,000 years or so in Europe. And now I think anti-Semitism is getting to be worse than it's been at any time since World War II. After World War II, for example, Germany was completely willing to do almost anything to assuage its guilt and its horror for what they had done in World War II. But today you have a fair amount of people in Germany even who are very anti-Semitic and leading anti-Semitic groups and causes. The Jewish population in Europe is shrinking, not increasing, because people are leaving to go to the United States or Canada or Australia or Israel. Anti-Semitism is on the rise, unfortunately, in this country as well. We have more anti-Semitic incidents being reported this year than we had last year, and last year was more than the previous year. And I do fear that what has occurred in the Middle East over the last couple of years is fueling anti-Semitism, rightly or wrongly, but it's producing more anti-Semitism.
These are certainly moments where we need to recommit to this idea of religious freedom for everyone and to confronting religious bigotry where we find it.
Well, the idea of, on paper, it sounds great. Let's have religious freedom. And it sounds wonderful, but the truth is the human brain is organized in a certain way that says, if you're not like me, I don't like you as much as I should. Now, why did that come about? If you think about it, the human brain is an amazing instrument. When humans came out of caves as Homo sapiens roughly 400,000 years ago, I can't imagine that the gorillas or the lions or the tigers or the elephants in Southeast Africa, where humans probably came out at first of caves and became Homo sapiens and vanquished the Neanderthals, I can't imagine that the animals said, wow, this funny-looking thing called a human is going to rule the world, because we weren't as big, tall, strong as the other animals. But we had this brain which was better than the brain that other animals had, and ultimately we conquered the earth, in effect, and as a result of it. But there was a flaw in the human brain. The flaw is, if you don't look like me, I might be willing to kill you or treat you poorly. Now, why did that develop in the human brain? It may have developed because before names came along, and people, they had to identify by faces whether somebody was a friend or foe. And so you would see people coming along, and if they didn't look like you, they might be an enemy. And so you kind of got in a habit of killing people or fighting people that didn't look like you. And ultimately this went on for thousands of years, and now we still have a flaw in our brain, which is if you don't look like me, you don't worship like me, I'm not going to like you as much. That brain flaw may continue for another 1,000 years or so. I hope not, but it may. And as a result, we still have religious discrimination, racial discrimination, sexual discrimination against people, and I don't think in my lifetime it's going to be eliminated, unfortunately.
I want to segue back to the Declaration and even Walter Isaacson's book around the greatest sentence ever written, and this idea of equality, right? This concept that all humans are created equal, I think is the radical claim to counter this kind of primal urge that you're talking about. And I want to go back to the history for a moment. You know, Jefferson drafted the Declaration and then got heavily edited. And Jefferson...
There were almost 80 changes made in the Declaration of Independence, and Jefferson never commented on it. He was a man who didn't talk publicly. He only gave one public speech as President of the United States in 8 years, one public speech. He didn't like to talk in public, had a high-pitched voice, and when there were 80 changes being made to his document at the Second Continental Congress, he never said one word. He never protested anything. He wasn't happy, but he never said anything about it. We'd write letters to his friends saying, don't you think my document was better than the one that they came up with? But he never did anything about it.
So in an earlier draft, Jefferson wrote the following: "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable, that all men are created equal and independent." But in the final version, Benjamin Franklin made the edit that says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident."
Right.
And I'm wondering if you could talk about that editorial moment, maybe some of the insights that we could get about both Franklin and Jefferson.
Well, what happened was, in the Second Continental Congress, John Adams, step back, up until 1776, in this country, people were not really interested in breaking away from England. Even though after the French and Indian War, the British imposed taxes on us, we didn't really like those taxes. We fought them, and there were many stamp taxes and other tea taxes and other things. We didn't like them, but there was not, the zeitgeist of the era was not to break away from England. Everybody regarded themselves as Englishmen. In fact, in the First Continental Congress, more people had been to England than had ever been to Philadelphia, because everybody related to England. That's where they were doing their commerce with England. They weren't doing commerce that much between the colonies. And so when the Second Continental Congress finally arose, it began to be more of a sense that the King, George, wasn't responding. He was never saying, I will get rid of these taxes. He was never responding to any of the entreaties that the colonies had sent to him. And so a publication by an Englishman, ironically, came out in January of 1776 called Common Sense. And that publication said, what are you Americans doing? You should break away and be independent. And John Adams led, among others, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia, led the effort to be independent. And so when they had the Second Continental Congress, they didn't have the right to break away and be independent. So John Adams and Richard Henry Lee of Virginia said, go back to your states or colonies and get permission to come back and vote for independence. During that period of time, a 5-person committee was drafted to write this statement about why we're going to break away, if in fact the vote to break away occurred. And Thomas Jefferson was put on it. He was 33 years old. John Adams was on it. Robert Livingston of New York, who later swore in George Washington as the first president, was on it. Roger Sherman of Connecticut was on it. And then also Benjamin Franklin. Franklin was considered an old man. He was 70. But too young to be president of the United States. And what happened was Thomas Jefferson did what most humans did in those days, or still do. He had 17 days to write the statement about why we're going to be independent. He waited the last 3 or 4 days. And then he finally turned it in on June the 28th. He turned the document in, and Benjamin Franklin and John Adams modestly edited it. They didn't want to offend him because he was very temperamental. They didn't want to offend him, so they gave some edits. It is said by Walter Isaacson in his book that Franklin made that change from sacred and undeniable to self-evident because Franklin was a good editor. But also, it is said that he is the one that Franklin put in the one that creator. The word creator was not in the original Declaration because Jefferson was not that religious a figure. Anyway, so Franklin and Adams made some changes, and then largely, though, it was drafted by Jefferson.
I want to make a jump now from Thomas Jefferson to Abraham Lincoln, from the sort of founding era to the Civil War era, and to follow this idea of all men are created equal. You know, when this was written, it was actually not really very popular.
Yes.
The preamble was sort of ignored, that it really wasn't until abolitionists began writing about this starting in the 1820s going forward that the promise of equality that Jefferson, the slave owner, had imagined and put to pen to paper on that aspirational ideal of equality really began to take hold. And then it was Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address that sort of had this moment of really interpreting and recommitting to this with his call to create a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. So I'm wondering if you could walk us
let me
from
try to
Jefferson
explain what was going on.
Yeah, to Lincoln.
When the Declaration of Independence was drafted, it was read, it was printed, read by George Washington to the troops. A copy was sent to King George, who allegedly never read it. But he had agents who responded, "What do you mean all men are created equal? You have slaves. What are you talking about? What are you talking about equality when you have slavery?" They were making fun of us, but King George never officially responded to it. What happened was the Declaration was more or less forgotten as a document for many, many years after it served its purpose of saying, we're breaking away, here are the sins of King George, and so forth. And so it wasn't really revived probably a little bit after the War of 1814. People became a little more proud of the country because we pulled together against the British again. But really, when the effort to eliminate slavery began in a serious way in the 1830s and 40s with the abolitionists, they began to cite this document that's saying all men are created equal. Now, how did Jefferson write that? What did he mean? He had owned more than 600 slaves during his life, and he obviously impregnated one of them with at least 6 children that we know of. So how did he think all people were created equal, and how was he able to take advantage of Sally Hemings in this way? Well, what he really meant was, he later would say, is all men in a state of nature are equal. In other words, before they joined civilization, they're theoretically equal. It was a very theoretical concept. But Lincoln came along, and he basically admired the Founding Fathers so much so that he always said, I'm not going to eliminate slavery because the Founding Fathers put it in the Constitution. So in Lincoln's inaugural address, the first one, he said, guess what? I'm not eliminating slavery. It's in the Constitution. We're only going to deal with eliminating slavery in the new states, not the existing ones, because it's already in the Constitution. But then when he came to the Gettysburg Address, he wrote a sentence that became the second most famous sentence in the English language. 77 years ago, referring back to the Declaration of Independence, not the Constitution, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now, Gary Wills wrote a book about that saying, this is a sleight of hand. What do you mean all men are created equal? That wasn't what the Civil War was theoretically about. It was about keeping the Union together, not all people created equal. In fact, Lincoln said many times, if keeping slavery was the way to keep the Union together, he would do that. Gary Wills said it was a sleight of hand because Lincoln had basically, in effect, said that we're fighting for equality when that really had not been the purpose of the war. And many Union soldiers protested the Gettysburg Address, saying, I'm not fighting to free these slaves. and language that's worse than that. And so I think Lincoln ultimately did issue the Emancipation Proclamation as a way to win the war. It wasn't because he believed in racial equality. He did not. In fact, Lincoln, when he was a member of Congress, proposed a bill that would say that we should take the slaves and send them to another country, in effect what was called colonization then. And even as President of the United States, even after he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln tried to get African American leaders to come to the White House, and he said to them, you should leave and go to Panama or another country in Latin America or to Liberia. And so Lincoln was the great emancipator, but he actually did it for reasons to help the war. Later he concluded he had to do it with the 13th Amendment. But Lincoln was the greatest president we ever had, but he didn't think that blacks and whites could live together. There's no doubt about that.
I want to jump ahead to John F. Kennedy and to what you started talking about being inspired by his inauguration speech. And I believe that you wrote in your book, The American Story, that you've read every biography that's ever been written on JFK and that he's a really inspirational figure for you. And I'm wondering if you could talk about why he is an inspirational figure for you.
Well, when I was a boy, I was more interested in baseball players probably than I was in presidents. When I was a little boy, I used to go down to the Lord Baltimore Hotel and try to wait for autographs. Some of the visiting players would come in, and they were very nice signed autographs. There was one player always would rush past and wouldn't sign the autograph, and I didn't know why he was so mean. He wasn't signing my autographs, and he always had his wife with him. But I later realized it probably wasn't his wife, and he was rushing into the elevator. There's a very famous center fielder for the New York Yankees. I won't mention his name. But when you're a boy, you idealize certain people and you make them better than they are. And as you get to know people closer, it's not always as great. As it's an old saying, nobody's a hero to their valet, because the valet actually knows all the flaws of the individual. John Kennedy had many flaws, as we now all know. Things have come out. He had health problems he didn't disclose. He had a personal life which was, let's say, indiscreet, if anything. But he did have the ability to energize American people with his rhetoric, written largely by Ted Sorensen, and he did have the ability to kind of motivate the country in some ways. And he was so young. He was 43 years old when he was inaugurated. Such a young figure. I looked it up. I always remember when I was a boy, Dwight Eisenhower was such an old-looking man. And I said, why? I couldn't believe how can anybody that old could be president. He was 62 years old when he was elected president. It seems like nothing today, and I'm older than he was when he left office. He left office when he was 70. So, but John Kennedy looked so young, and I just admired his vision and the kind of things he stood for. But he had his flaws, as we all know. But I did admire him, and I've probably given more money to things named after him than anybody in the country. A lot of money to the Kennedy Center, which I chaired until I was replaced by somebody replaced me as chair of the Kennedy Center. And then I've been a big donor to the Kennedy School at Harvard and a big donor to the Kennedy Library. And so I admire him for what he did, and he was he had a lot of great characteristics, I thought.
So Kennedy was important to this kind of idea of American experiments with religion and democracy, right, because he was the first Catholic, the first not Protestant Christian to be elected. And I know in my family, sort of Irish American Catholics, a photo, of Kennedy was in sort of different relatives' houses as a point of pride. And there was a really strong anti-Catholic bias in this country when he was elected. He, in his campaign speech, went down to Texas and was at the Greater Houston Ministerial Association talking to Protestant ministers. And Kennedy says the following again in his campaign speech: because I am a Catholic and no Catholic has ever been elected president, the real issues in this campaign have been obscured. So it is apparently necessary for me to state once again not what kind of church I believe in, for that should be important only to me, but what kind of America I believe in. And I'm just wondering how Kennedy's Catholic identity, Catholic faith sort of factor into your appraisal of him.
Well, I didn't focus on it that much at the time. John Kennedy, there had been a person running for president of the United States before who was Catholic, Al Smith, in 1928, and lost. Many people thought because he was Catholic. John Kennedy sought the Democratic nomination for vice president in 1956, lost it on the ticket to Adlai Stevenson, and many people thought that maybe he'd lost it because he was Catholic. And his father, Joseph Kennedy, said, you know, be careful, don't run for vice president, because if you don't get the nomination, people will attribute to your being Catholic, and you want to run for president 60. When he ran for president, it was an issue, because the country had never elected a Catholic president. And John Kennedy confronted the ministers in Dallas. He did the best he could with that issue. And he was lucky in many ways that he got the nomination, because he got the nomination in part because he won in West Virginia, the key primary, but the state was like 96% Protestant. But he won anyway, and that really helped him get the nomination. I think there was a concern at the time that people said the Pope is going to be dictating to the president what our U.S. government policies were. That was a concern, and there were many ministers who were Protestant ministers were very much leading the charge against Kennedy, but he overcame it, and I think Nixon, to his credit, didn't really try to make a big issue of it himself.
I want to talk about Martin Luther King Jr., and you had interviewed Taylor Branch a few years ago, and Taylor
Nice
Branch...
Baltimorean.
Yes, he is also an ICJS emeritus trustee and dear friend to the organization. And when you were interviewing Taylor Branch, you were asking Taylor to speculate on what would have happened to the civil rights movement if King had died in 1958 when he was brutally stabbed in Harlem, rather than 1968 when he was assassinated in Memphis. And I'm just going to read quickly the quote that Taylor Branch responded to you, and to your provocative question. So Branch writes, King consistently put one foot in the scriptures and one foot in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence in a balanced way that invited people to understand the mission for equal citizenship, either in secular terms or spiritual terms. They could take their choice. King didn't try to subdue one with the other. It was the gift of his rhetoric that made it seem both religiously and spiritually inspiring and patriotic in a way that people couldn't resist. It's that patriotism that we've really lost today. And I think this is a core idea for us, that we can have one foot in the spiritual and one in the secular.
As you know, there are two great theories of history. One is the great man theory, the great person theory, and then there's the theory that there are events that don't require great people to do anything. And if you take the theory that the civil rights movement was going to occur, whether Martin Luther King was part of it or not, you would say that probably we would be where we are to some extent, even if Martin Luther King hadn't prevailed, because in the end, he was a leader, but there were many other leaders as well. Remember, he was assassinated at the age of 39, and much of the civil rights movement actually occurred, and revolution occurred after he was gone. And today, a book has come out not long ago. I interviewed the author where he's saying that Malcolm X, although he was considered a radical person at the time and not a great civil rights leader the way Martin Luther King was, is today much more influential, according to this author, than Martin Luther King is today. But Martin Luther King had a gift for speech. He was, when he went to Boston University to get his PhD, which later was said to have been plagiarized, he was thinking seriously of marrying a woman who was white. And his father said to him, look, don't do that. You'll have no career as a minister, and you'll have no career in the black church, in the black community. And ultimately, Martin Luther King decided not to pursue a white wife. He married Coretta Scott King, and then he pursued the career he had. He was a gifted orator, and the famous speech that he gave in August of '63 was a speech that many blacks had heard before, and it wasn't so unusual to them. The reason whites made such a big deal of it, subsequently, not at the time, was because many whites had never been in a black church. And the rhythm the cadence he was using was kind of a black minister's cadence, and it was seen as very unusual to the white ears, the white audience, and that's ultimately became, his most famous speech ever, and one of the most famous speeches ever given in the country. And it was largely extemporaneous because he had a prepared text, and then he departed from it, and then he gave the standard stump speech he gave him, but most people had never heard it before. And then John Kennedy saw him right afterwards. He said, I have a dream. And it was a speech that nobody will ever forget, whoever was there or who watched it subsequently. Martin Luther King was a leader, but I think the civil rights movement would have occurred even had he not played the role he did. I think it was inevitable that it would happen.
I want to spend a little bit more time with you on this idea of rhetoric and the capacity to inspire folks. And I'm wondering if you see it anywhere today in our current moments, and if you could maybe share some reflections about what does it mean to be an inspirational leader, but also someone who can put out good ideas into the world.
As I get older, my hearing isn't as good, so I'm not sure I heard that question. But no, as Dwight Eisenhower once said when somebody asked him, "Can you think of one thing that Dick Nixon did as vice president in 8 years?" He said, "If you give me a week, I'll think of something." No, to be honest, there are obviously inspirational leaders, but politicians today are just, they have to be on the far left or the far right. You raise money only if you raise issues that are appealing to the far left or far right. Nobody raises money saying, "I'm going to go to Washington and be right down the middle, and I'll balance things and try to come out with an even-handed position on things." That doesn't get you any money, and that you'd have to have money to raise to be in politics. So we've driven our politicians to the far left and the far right because money is unlimited in terms of money you can raise, sadly. And so there are some talented leaders, politicians, but I don't want to hurt anybody by announcing how great they are, because I might hurt their chances to get elected if I say, look, I am friendly with a lot of politicians. I don't give money to politicians. My theory is I don't want people to say I'm bribing my politician, I'm trying to get special favors. So for 40 years, I've given no money to politicians, and I don't give any money to any politician ever. But, it's corrupting, there's no doubt about it. And if you enter my position, people are going to ask me for large sums, and then it's really corrupting. But I do admire a lot of politicians. When I might say I admire them right now, I might be hurting them. Because people say, well, Rubenstein, he's not a good guy, and he's endorsing this person, but there are many good politicians. And look, I admire, for example, the governor of the state, person I once tried to convince to go into private equity, join my firm, but he wanted to go into something else, and he ultimately did something in New York in Robin Hood, which is very good, and he got elected governor. I told him he wouldn't be elected governor the first time around, but I was wrong. I'm always wrong about politics, and he's done a pretty good job in a difficult situation. He's a very talented young leader, and he's got a real future, I think. But I'm wrong lots of times. I told Barack Obama he wouldn't get anywhere either, and I told Jimmy Carter he wasn't going to make it either. So I'm wrong a lot, and you just never know. You never know who's going to take over. For example, Donald Trump. I've interviewed Donald Trump, and my parents retired to the suburb of Baltimore called West Palm Beach, Florida. When they retired there, I went down there, and whenever I have wedding anniversaries or parties, I would rent a room for my parents, and it would be in a place called Mar-a-Lago. And it was owned by a guy named Donald Trump, who I didn't really know. And every time we would have the event, he would come and buy the event and kind of have a picture taken with us. And I didn't really know him. And he, photobombed our family events, and I had a lot of pictures of him. And then one time, as the head of the Economic Club of Washington, I was looking for a speaker and like an interview, and somebody said, "Why don't you get Donald Trump? You said you know him." I said, "Well, he's not that successful a businessman." They said, "No, but he's got a TV show called The Apprentice." And I'd never seen the show. And they said, "It's a very popular show." So I said, okay. I sent him a letter, said, "Dear Donald, you remember me? You're the guy who photobombed all my family event portraits. And would you come and let me interview you?" And he did. And he came to the Economic Club of Washington. We had 800 people. It was covered on C-SPAN. And he asked me two questions. He said, "Ask me anything you want, but two questions for sure." He said, "Ask me." One is, ask me if I'm going to run for president. I said, "President what?" He said, President of the United States. I said, "Donald, you're not going to be President of the United States." He said, "I know, but it'll help my brand." What's the other question? Ask me if my hair is real and pull my hair, because people think it's fake. I'm not going to pull your hair, but anyway. So I had the interview. He called me next day and said, "That was the best interview I ever had. I'm going to make you an honor to remember Mar-a-Lago," which he did for about a week or two. And then he said, "This was the highest rated show in the history of C-SPAN." So I called Brian Lamb, the head of C-SPAN, and said, "What were the ratings?" He said, "We don't have ratings." But I didn't think Donald Trump had any chance in the world of being president the first time. The second time, I thought it was analogous to when Napoleon was kicked out of France, he went to Elba. And nobody thought he'd ever escape Elba. And I thought Mar-a-Lago was like Elba. But I was wrong. Donald Trump came back and obviously got elected president again, so I was wrong. I'm usually wrong about who's going to be elected president of the United States. I just never know.
having a good time. I'm enjoying this conversation. But we are in a serious moment, too. And I'm just wondering if there's a phrase or a document or an idea that you go back to in moments of national crisis or uncertainty?
Well, I bought a rare copy of the Bill of Rights, and those are the rights that, remember, our Constitution was drafted, there was no Bill of Rights in it, and at the Constitutional Convention, a couple people refused to vote for it because they didn't have a Bill of Rights, and eventually James Madison got the idea that we needed one, but he didn't want one then. But eventually, when he became a member of Congress, he drafted a Bill of Rights, and ultimately, it got approved. It took some doing, but it got approved. And I think the Bill of Rights is a document that protects our way of life in many ways. I think the Constitution itself, when you think about it, the Constitution was drafted by 50-some white Christian property-owning men. No Jews. I don't think there are any Catholics there either.
No women.
No women. No blacks. So you have 50-some white Christian property-owning men came up with a document that we're still living with largely, with a limited number of amendments. When you think about it, if you eliminate the Bill of Rights and the Prohibition amendments, you've got about 15 amendments that are still part of it. So it is amazing that we're still living in this document. Most documents, most constitutions don't live that long. So I think that is, I think the genius of the Founding Fathers was to create that document. That's, with all of its flaws, it's still the best Constitution anybody's ever come up with. That's an inspirational document. The Emancipation Proclamation, I own several copies of those, and that's fairly inspirational as well. And there are many historic documents that I think have taken us to where we are today. And the 1964 Civil Rights Act is one of them. When you think about it, that outlawed things that have been going on in this country for 200 years, and it was only in '64, my lifetime, when that had happened.
If you had the opportunity to invite any two of our nation's founders to dinner, who would you invite and what would you talk about?
Well, the indispensable man of the founding of the country was George Washington. He was the general that lost more battles than he won, but he ultimately won the war. He didn't have many troops, he didn't have much munitions, but he managed to figure out how to win the war. And then he presided over the Constitutional Convention. Without his having done so, we probably wouldn't have the Constitution, because he was the only person who could preside over it and probably make it pass, and he helped to get it ratified. And then he became the first president of the United States, though he didn't want to be president. No male member of his family had lived past the age of 50, and he was 57 at the time. So he didn't really want the job, but he took it. He was the indispensable founding father. A second, I would say, is probably Benjamin Franklin in many ways. He was the wise old man who signed the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and did many things to help bring about the peace. And a fairly wise, very talented person, but discoveries that he made in the science world were more significant than what he did for our country in many ways. And then Thomas Jefferson, because he wrote the famous Declaration of Independence and did other things, and then doubled the size of the country when he was president by getting the Louisiana Purchase. Those are probably the three, I would say, and then fourth, probably James Madison, who was known as the father of the Constitution, and the person who was most responsible for the drafting of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. So those are probably the four indispensable ones, though, ironically, none of them have a famous play written about them. Hamilton has the play, and I imagine these other founding fathers sitting in heaven saying, how come he got the play written about him? How come he's famous? He wasn't such a great guy, and he died early. But who knows?
So I want to turn to the 1988 movie Bull Durham, which begins with an iconic line, "I believe in the Church of Baseball." And I have to share with you that in my family, we too believe in the Church of Baseball, although I confess that we are an interfaith baseball household. My husband and daughter are Cubs fans, and my son and I are Orioles fans, but we make this work. So we're 2 days away from opening day at Camden Yards, and I wanted to give my 12-year-old son, who's in the audience tonight, the chance to ask you a baseball question. So here we go. So first, he wanted to let you know that he is a catcher. He also plays second base and third base. And he is currently reading John Miller's book, The Last Manager, on Earl Weaver. And he's really into thinking about the Oriole way. And in some ways, this is the creed of Baltimore's Church of Baseball, in some ways. And so what do you think is the most important part of the Oriole way for the team this year?
Well, Baltimore was in the major leagues, what was then the major leagues, in the late 1800s. And then when the American League started in 1901, they kind of got rid of Baltimore. And so we were a minor league franchise up until 1954. And then the American League kind of forced Bill Veeck to sell the St. Louis Browns to two people in Baltimore who bought it, and for a price of roughly $2.2 million. And then Baltimore reconfigured Memorial Stadium, and then later the state of Maryland really built, the Maryland Stadium Authority built the Camden Yards. The Baltimore Orioles, I think, are more important to the city of Baltimore than the other baseball teams are to their cities. We have a lot of challenges in Baltimore. We lost our hockey team, we lost our basketball team, and for about 15 years we lost our football team. And the Orioles have always been here since 1954, and they kind of combine many virtues of the city and bring the city together. And so I think the Orioles have had some bad luck in some recent years, but we've had some great virtues. We've been in 6 World Series, we've won 3. I've written a book that'll come out in September about why I bought the Orioles and why Baltimore, I hope, will rally around the Orioles. And we've redone the stadium on the off-season, and I hope people go and see it. It's magnificent, and we have some more changes to do in the next off-season, but you'll see a scoreboard that's 2.5 times bigger than the one we had before, and you'll see many things that are much better than we had before. So I'm really pleased that the Maryland Stadium Authority was able to give us the money to do this. And, baseball is a religion in many ways. There are some people that care more about baseball and baseball statistics than virtually anything else. And we have a lot of fans. A friend of mine from high school, who's now a state legislator, has been going to games and keeping score for 50 years, Sandy Rosenberg. And there are many people who just come up to me all the time saying, I've been a season ticket holder for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. And it's amazing how many people really worship the Orioles. And we have a much better team than we had last year. We've got about 9 new players, and we've spent a lot of money in the offseason. We've fixed up our spring training facilities to the best in baseball. The stadium now, Camden Yards, is in pretty good shape. We'll make some more changes the next offseason. But baseball is a difficult game. You've got 30 teams, and only one can win the World Series. So we'll see how we do. We need some luck. Last year we lost the second most games in the Major League Baseball because of injuries. But we lost, according to WAR statistic, about 17 games. So I think the Orioles will be good, and I just hope we get the fans to come out, because I hope we give a good product the fans can rally around. And I was at the spring training game the other day we had with the Nationals. We did quite well, and we had good fan support. Hopefully everybody will be here on opening day, and we'll see. I hope it works. I think the city of Baltimore can rally around the Orioles, and the Orioles can really help energize Baltimore in many ways that I think are helpful. So as to your son, I would say, I hope he can make the major leagues, but, I tried out my high school baseball team. I'll never forget. I thought I was a good Little League baseball player, but it was an all-Jewish Little League, so I thought I was going to be Sandy Koufax or something. It turned out I wasn't that good. But when I went to Baltimore City College, I tried out for the junior varsity team, and my class in Baltimore City College had 1,500 people in the class, and about 1,400 of them tried out for the junior varsity baseball team. But I was a shortstop, and those are the days when shortstops are like Luis Aparicio, Willie Miranda. They couldn't hit very much, and they could field. And I was a good fielder. So after 2 days of practice, and the coach called me in and said, David, I really want you on the team. I said, wow, this is great. I can't wait to tell my mother. I want you to be the manager. I said, the manager? Yeah, I'm ready. I'm only 14 years old. I'm not really ready to be the manager. He said, let me tell you what the manager does. What is it? You bring the equipment to each of the games and make sure all the towels are there and so forth. So I said, geez, that was the end of my baseball playing career. But anyway.
Well, thank you so much, David. This has been a delightful conversation. We're going to wrap things up here, but before you go, we are going to share a brief video, a 3-minute video, to place tonight's conversation in the context of ICJS and to really sort of talk about the issues that David and I have been discussing. At ICJS, we're designing educational programs to equip people of many faiths and no faith to build a multi-religious democracy, to envision what this means, that all people are created equal. And we see this as our piece of the great American experiment. The question of how to gather is arguably one of the more important questions of our current moment, because we are so polarized, but we're also isolated. And so it's a practice that we've lost.
To dismantle religious bias and bigotry, ICJS builds learning communities where religious difference becomes a powerful force for good.
The impact of ICJS comes in the relationships and connections that people can develop here. Those relationships start in conversation.
Relationships are built at the speed of trust, and that's what ICJS does, and that is overwhelmingly powerful.
It's a place that promotes dialogue over debate to bring people together to build a stronger multi-faith society.
There's just something about being in a space that wants you to, I think, lean into understanding religious difference that both challenges me and empowered me.
I started off having the kids in my public school here in Baltimore to veer away from religion. You know, I didn't want to get into those thorny issues. And I found that through ICJS, I was really allowed to question that and question whether or not that was really the best way to go. And what I discovered was that it was really a time for kids to embrace each other and embrace each other's belief systems.
It was entirely an open opportunity to engage with others and to be true to myself and to be able to express my own beliefs, my own community's traditions in terms that felt authentic to me.
It's work with the ICJS that continues to give me hope. The fact that it's a whole group of individuals from different faiths who are coming together with this one purpose of understanding tolerance, dismantling bias and bigotry to build religious communities.
Oh, absolutely changed my way of interacting and my way of being in the world. I approach things much more openly without that dualistic way of thinking of us and them, and trying to break down those walls, those barriers, to communicate with people and carry that into my own life in a way that maybe I can understand and grow in my own spirituality.
It really helped to, I think, take away some of those blinders that you did not know that existed in yourself.
I could be my authentic self in that space, and those other persons from their faith perspectives could be their authentic selves.
It was very nourishing to deeply connect with people who were from different faiths, different walks of life, and really find that shared humanity.
The power is really in human connection, in trying to live a life that is relationally diverse. I think by allowing ourselves to have more people in our lives from different backgrounds, that helps us to grow, helps the other to grow, and it also changes this climate of fear and misunderstanding.
We see our differences as a potential asset for building a shared community, and so we invite people into that creative space.
And ICJS has taught me can keep the conversation going, invite more people to the table, put more seats out, lengthen the table, bring more people to it. Don't end the conversation, continue it.
While the United States is more religiously diverse than ever before, having a multi-religious democracy where all people are created equal is not a given. We urgently need places and forums and conversations and opportunities to engage in our deepest differences. And ICJS is such a place here in Maryland. This is hard work, this is sacred work, it's civic work, it's also sometimes fun and funny work. We are continuing the American experiment that we began more than 250 years ago. And I'm proud to announce tonight that we are launching the public phase of Advancing Hope, Dismantling Hate, the Campaign for the Interreligious Society, an effort to raise $7 million to invest in ICJS programming over the next decade to make events like this free and open to the public. With the support of 70 donors, we've already raised 81% of our goal, and now we're, thank you. And now we're extending this invitation to you to join us in this wider community, to join us in this work, and to join us in supporting this institution and what we're doing for the state of Maryland and for our country. Thank you for being with us tonight, and we hope to see you again soon. And please do sign up for our email lists and other communications. We'll also recorded tonight's lecture, and we'll be sending that out as well. And I'm grateful for you all. Thank you.